If you think camping is all s'mores and stories by the campfire,
Think again.
you think you're alone in the woods. But what if you're not? Out there, in the dead of night.
No one can hear you scream.
The first story in this episode is scary. The final story
Is downright terrifying.
When we were kids, my cousins and I had a bush house at the end of our nan's back garden. It was right where the land opened up onto the heath. It was our perfect little haven. We spent as much time as we possibly could there, playing, singing and dancing. But one day, that all changed. Me and two of my cousins witnessed something we still can't explain to this day. Something absolutely terrifying. Since I've used a wheelchair from birth, my gran decided that instead of a treehouse, something I'd have to climb, it would be much safer and more practical to have a bush house, something that we could all enjoy. We protested, of course. I may be disabled, but that never stopped me from climbing trees at the park or on the heath, with a little help from my cousins, of course. But Gran's word was final. She was the kindest, most loving matriarch you could imagine, but she was also as tough as nails, and when she made up her mind, nobody argued. So we got to work. We chose the perfect bush for our hideout, and Gran gave the older boys jobs, clearing out the area around it and creating a little hollow inside. They even laid down spare pieces of wood so my wheelchair could roll smoothly. Meanwhile, Gran organised the younger ones, getting furniture, decorations and supplies to make the space cosy. A year later, our bush house had become a second home. During the day, we played there after school, on weekends and throughout the holidays. In the evenings, it became a hangout spot for our older cousins, a place they could escape the watchful eyes of Gran and we had been. It really was a magical little place. Beanbags, cushions, a small table with a makeshift tablecloth, and even a cupboard where we kept snacks. Our Auntie Janet made curtains for us, and one of Gran's bingo friends, Jean, gave us an old rug, worn and out of style, but to us it was perfect. Sometimes when the older boys were around, we were even allowed to use the camping stove to cook beans and sausages or make tea. Everything about it felt safe and familiar, until one summer afternoon when something happened that none of us could explain. It was early July, in the middle of the summer holidays. Lewis and I were 7, and Grace was 11. Our older cousin, Andrew, had been with us earlier, but got bored and left around 3 to meet his friends. He promised to be back later to cook dinner on the stove. Lewis and I were sitting at the table playing Beggar My Neighbour with a deck of cards we'd grabbed from the living room. Grace was curled up in the corner on a beanbag, rereading The Secret Garden for the 3rd time. It was just an ordinary, peaceful afternoon. Then, around 4 o'clock, we heard it. A strange sound broke the quiet. Something between a low growl, an owl's hoot, and a low mumbling sound. We weren't exactly outdoorsy kids, but we were smart enough to know that owls are nocturnal. Whatever it was we'd just heard wasn't right. Then came another sound, a soft, deliberate rustling from just behind the bush house. It was close, right behind where Grace was sitting. She jumped up, clamping a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Through the dense foliage, we caught a glimpse of something, a dark, dog-sized shape. But it wasn't a dog. It had a strange, almost translucent quality, like it was there, but also not there, shifting in and out of the shadows. And then we noticed something even eerier. The world had gone silent. No birds, no insects, no distant hum of voices, cars or dogs. Nothing. Living on a busy council estate, there was always background noise. But in that very moment, it was as if time had frozen, and the only things that existed were us three and that strange, shadowy figure. We were terrified. Without speaking, Grace and Lewis grabbed the handles of my wheelchair and slowly pulled me backwards, our eyes never leaving the figure. We didn't stop until we were clear of the bush house and close enough to home to feel safe. Then, Grace did something unexpected. "Stay here," she whispered. "Don't move or make a sound." Before we could stop her, she bolted towards the garden shed, climbing up onto its rotting roof. I let out a panicked squeak, my fear bubbling over, but quick-witted as ever, Lewis clapped a hand over my mouth, silencing me. From our position, we could see Grace's face as she peered over the hedgerow that separated our garden from the heath. Her expression was a mix of confusion and fear, her wide brown eyes darting back and forth. When she finally climbed back down, we bombarded her with questions. "What did you see?" I asked. She hesitated, biting her lip, a nervous habit she still has to this day. "There was a man," she finally said. "I saw him walking towards the iron fence." Lewis and I exchanged bewildered glances. "What man?" I asked. "What did he look like?" "I didn't see his face," Grace admitted. "Just his back. He had really long, scruffy hair though." For a long time we sat in silence, staring at the end of the garden. The world had returned to normal. The distant sounds of traffic, people chatting, and birds singing had all resumed, as if nothing had happened. It was as if what it was had disappeared, and the world had simply clicked back into place. Later that evening, Andrew and his friends came back. They immediately sensed something was off and asked what was wrong. We told them everything. Two of the boys ran straight out to check the heath, disappearing for about 45 minutes. When they returned, they shrugged. "Didn't see anything," one of them said. "No weird guy, no animals, nothing strange at all." That night, we tried our best to shake it off. We ate dinner in the bush house, then went back inside to watch films and eat junk food. But none of us could shake the feeling that we'd witnessed something wrong, something unnatural. We didn't even tell Mum about it until years later, when we were fully grown. Even now, we still don't know what we saw that day, and quite honestly, I don't think we ever will. I've never had a supernatural experience before, and quite honestly, I don't really believe in that sort of thing. I lived in my van for years, and have been in plenty of situations where I've felt uneasy, whether it was worrying about something happening, or questioning if the other people camping nearby had bad intentions. But last Saturday night was very different. I felt a level of fear I didn't even know was possible. Paralysing, gut-wrenching terror, unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. My friend and I had gone camping in the Swell, Utah, near the entrance to the Black Dragon Wash Canyon. On the drive in, we hadn't seen a single other car, and by the time we set up camp, we felt like we had the whole area to ourselves. That night, around 1 AM, we were lying in our tent, laughing and joking, with my dog curled up next to us. Out of nowhere, he snapped to attention, ears up, body tense, and started growling at something outside. Immediately, we both fell silent and listened. At first, it was just a faint sound, something moving in the darkness. But then, we heard slow, deliberate footsteps. And a moment later, the unmistakable sound of a zipper being pulled. It wasn't ours. A wave of dread crashed over me. Every instinct I had screamed that something was horribly, dangerously wrong. The night air was still, unnervingly quiet, except for those slow, moving steps. I fumbled for my phone and called my boyfriend, who was back home. The second he picked up, I hung up and quickly texted him. There's someone outside our tent. We need help. I've been in dangerous situations before, situations where I've had to physically fight back, but this was different. I felt utterly helpless, frozen in place while my dog continued growling. His head darting in different directions as if tracking movement all around us. This wasn't just one person, it sounded like at least two circling our tent. My boyfriend and 911, who I was also texting, kept asking if it could have been animals, but I know it wasn't. The noises were too deliberate. The footsteps were too slow, too heavy. I could hear the subtle rustling of clothes. No scurrying, no animal-like gait, just the unsettling sound of something watching. At times, everything would go silent, making us wonder if it was over. But then the movement would start up again, and it sounded like even more people were out there. The worst part was that we had a light on inside the tent, meaning whatever was out there could see us, but we couldn't see them. It felt like we were being watched, studied even, and we were too afraid to do anything that might provoke whoever or whatever might be out there. At one point, I swear I saw a shadow shift outside the tent, and just minutes before the sheriff arrived, I saw something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. And pressing against the fabric of the tent, slowly dragging across it. But this hand didn't look human. It was too long, the fingers stretched and bony. There were no trees near us, no branches brushing against the material. This was a distinct shape, a humanoid shape. When the sheriff finally arrived, we scrambled out of the tent. He seemed convinced it had been a deer, but I know that's not what we heard. We had been loud inside that tent. No timid animal would have approached, and certainly not to the point of unzipping something. And what kind of deer presses a hand against the tent? I've never had a supernatural experience before, and quite honestly, I don't really believe in that sort of thing. I lived in my van for years, and have been in plenty of situations where I felt uneasy, whether it was worrying about something happening, or questioning if the other people camping nearby had bad intentions. But last Saturday night was very different. I felt a level of fear I didn't even know was possible. Paralysing, gut-wrenching terror, unlike anything I'd ever experienced before. At first, it was just a faint sound, something moving in the darkness. But then, we heard slow, deliberate footsteps. And a moment later, the unmistakable sound of a zipper being pulled. It wasn't ours. I felt utterly helpless, frozen in place while my dog continued growling. His head darting in different directions as if tracking movement all around us. This wasn't just one person, it sounded like at least two circling our tent. It felt like we were being watched, studied even, and we were too afraid to do anything that might provoke whoever or whatever might be out there. At one point, I swear I saw a shadow shift outside the tent, and just minutes before the sheriff arrived, I saw something else, something that sent a chill down my spine. I felt ridiculous trying to explain it, like I was losing my mind. But when I think back to that night, all I feel is relief. Relief that I made that call. Relief that we got out. Because, as crazy as it sounds, I can't help but feel that if we'd stayed any longer, we wouldn't have made it out of there alive. I don't know how to describe the fear I felt. Terrified doesn't even come close. At one point, I was so convinced I was going to die that I started texting my boyfriend what I thought would be my final words, telling him he was the best thing that ever happened to me, that he deserved love and happiness, and that no matter what, he should go on to have the family he always dreamed of. I know how all this must sound. I know how it makes me sound. But I can't ignore what my instincts were screaming at me that night. I can't ignore how, even now, if I hadn't made that call when I did, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened. Have you ever experienced anything like this?
If you're enjoying this episode so far, please do me a massive favour by clicking on the like button and subscribing to the channel. Now, on to the next story.
I used to love our family camping trips when I was a child. I have so many awesome memories of setting up camp and spending time in the wilderness. But there's one particular memory that changed all of that. A memory that I can't shake. Something that still haunts me to this day. Growing up in a deeply religious household, I was never exposed to stories of the supernatural. Outside of angels and demons, we didn't discuss anything unexplained, and the only scary creature I had ever heard of was Bigfoot. Despite this, I always felt drawn to the unknown. This story takes place when I had just turned 8. My family had planned a trip to Northern Ontario to enjoy the vibrant fall colours while camping. After a long drive, we arrived, set up our tent, built a fire pit and settled in. I was helping my dad cut firewood when we suddenly realised my 6-year-old brother was missing. Panic set in immediately. The sun had already started to dip below the trees, casting long shadows across the campsite. My parents searched frantically, calling his name and scouring the area. Eventually, they told me to stay behind in case he returned, while they ventured further out to look for him. I was alone for about 15 minutes when I heard something rustling in the underbrush at the edge of our campsite. At first I told myself to stay put, just like my parents had instructed. But then, I heard my brother's voice, calling for help from that same direction.
Thomas, please help.
Against my better judgment, I grabbed the walking stick I'd picked up earlier that day and started towards the sound, wary of the possibility of wild animals. Pushing through the dense underbrush was difficult, especially with my short legs, but I pressed on. My growing sense of unease was easy to dismiss at first. I was just worried about my brother after all. After several minutes of trudging through the thick forest, I came across a steep but climbable rock face. Thinking I might get a better vantage point, I scrambled up, scraping my hands and knees on the rough surface. At the top, the view was breathtaking. Autumn leaves blanketed the ground, their colours mixing with the deep greens of the underbrush. Under different circumstances, I might have admired it, but something felt wrong. I scanned the area, searching for any sign of my brother, but he was nowhere to be seen. That creeping unease that had followed me since leaving the campsite surged into full-blown dread. I turned to head back down, but then I saw it. At first, I thought I was just looking at a cluster of birch trees at the edge of the clearing. But then, one of the branches moved, bending, shifting unnaturally. My eyes followed the movement until I saw it in its entirety. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, its emaciated body nearly blending into the trees. Its skin was pale, almost unnaturally so, making it difficult to distinguish from the white bark of the birches. It was spindly, with limbs that seemed far too long for its body, but the worst part was its face. Gaunt, hollow-cheeked, and stretched in a permanent, menacing grimace. It reminded me of Gollum from The Lord of the Rings, but much worse. My body locked up in terror. I knew that no matter how fast I ran, that thing could probably catch up with me if it wanted to, but I had to move. I turned and half ran, half fell down the rocky slope, ignoring the sharp pain of scrapes and bruises forming as I tumbled. Somehow, I managed to retrace my steps back to camp. My parents were still gone, so I climbed into our van and curled up, shaking. At some point, I must have passed out from exhaustion and the crash of adrenaline. The next thing I knew, my dad was shaking me awake. They had found my brother by the river, scared but unharmed. He had followed the water upstream with a new friend he had met, only to lose his way. Thankfully, park rangers were familiar with kids getting lost in that area of the woods, and they found them quickly. I tried my best to explain what I'd seen, but my parents quickly dismissed it as an overactive imagination. We spent one last uneventful night at the campsite, apart from some raccoons getting into our food. The next morning we packed up and left. To this day, I remember that creature with absolute clarity. Its image is burned into my mind, and I still bear faint scars from my frantic descents down the slope. It was only years later that I learned about legends like the Wendigo. But the part that still haunts me to this day, my brother had been found by the river. But the voice I heard calling to me was coming from entirely the opposite direction.
That's all for today. I really hope you enjoyed those stories. For more terrifying stories just like this, click here. As always, thanks for watching. I'm your host, Severed Soul.